Please welcome on stage the Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, Hansen Bundt.
Admiral, General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to welcome you to the second day of the 2026 Oslo Security Conference. This year's conference is being held under the title The Transatlantic Partnership Facing the New Normal. The title reflects a profound shift in the international environment confronting the transatlantic community. Yesterday's discussion made one thing clear. The transatlantic partnership is operating in a far less predictable and more contested environment. External pressure from authoritarian powers, most visibly Russia's war against Ukraine, no overlaps with growing uncertainty about the strength of Western cohesion and institutions. This convergence of challenges is what defines the new normal, confronting the transatlantic community. Against this backdrop, today we turn from diagnosis to strategy. How can small and medium-sized states like Norway safeguard their security interests in an international system increasingly shaped by rivalry among great powers who puts might before right? Norway is a key frontline state in the high north, with responsibility for monitoring Russian nuclear posture on the Kola Peninsula, and with critical entry points for Allied reinforcement. Norway's security is inseparable from maritime deterrence and cooperation. Modernizing and strengthening the Royal Norwegian Navy is therefore a main priority for the Norwegian government. However, as one of Europe's small states, Norway is dependent upon allies with shared interests who are willing and able to prioritize collective defense in our areas. The recent bilateral Lunna Agreement with our long-term ally Britain is an example of that. At the same time, maritime security in the North Atlantic is increasingly linked to developments beyond our immediate region. Global naval power competition intensifies, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, as the United States, the strongest military power in NATO, is prioritizing its military rivalry with China. Thus, today, our main topic is the new geostrategy of the maritime domain. We will start with the maritime cooperation in the North Atlantic, then sail as the Norwegian frigate KNM Roald Amundsen did last year into the Indo-Pacific to explore how Allied naval cooperation is developing in an era of global strategic competition. And on that note, it is my pleasure to introduce State Secretary Andreas Flåm from the Ministry of Defense. Please, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is a privilege to be here with you today at the Oslo Security Conference. We gather at a time when Europe faces its greatest security test in decades. As the topic of the conference points out, the transatlantic community need to adjust to a rapidly changing strategic landscape. A strategic landscape where Europe needs to navigate in an emerging new normal, marked by increased unpredictability, intensified strategic competition, and where major powers test the limits of the rules-based order. In May last year, we put forward Norway's first national security strategy. The strategy was drawn up against the backdrop of the most serious security situation our country has faced since the Second World War. Talking to you in the start of 2026, I believe further developments has underlined the message in this statement. A new era has begun for Norway and for Europe as a whole. Yesterday, you heard my Prime Minister's reflections on how Norway will navigate in this new normal. Ensuring deeper ties with European allies in our own region is one of them. The recent bilateral Lunna Agreement, which Kate just mentioned, with our long-term ally Britain, is one example of that. The strategic partnership with Germany, building upon our common acquisition of new submarines, is another. As allies and partners across the North Sea, we have a shared commitment to and responsibility for High North and Euro-Atlantic stability and security. Joined by the Northern Seas as maritime nations, the maritime domain is at the heart of these agreements. So let me begin by pointing to the importance of the maritime domain. The maritime domain underpins the function of the global system. More than 80% of global trade is transported by sea. Over 95% of the world's digital data flows through undersea cables. Energy supplies, food security, industrial production, and military reinforcement all depend on secure maritime routes. At the same time, the maritime domain is becoming a central theater for strategic competition. The United States remains the world's leading maritime power, but faces sustained challenges from near-peer competitors. China is investing heavily in a blue water navy and maritime infrastructure with global reach. Russia continues to prioritize maritime and undersea capabilities as key instruments of strategic influence. Maritime power today is not defined solely by fleet size or firepower. It is about presence, access, denial, and endurance. Naval forces are increasingly used as political tools to signal intent, shape behavior, and test thresholds, often below or the level of armed conflict. This also makes the maritime domain essential for effective deterrence and defense in NATO and among allies. To provide a credible nuclear deterrence from the sea, to ensure sea control, power projection, and sea denial, for assured maritime access, freedom of navigation, maneuver, and action in the maritime domain, to protect sea lines of communication and securing undersea infrastructure, and to provide hard power required to prevail in conflict. This requires sustained investment, enhanced interoperability, and closer coordination among allies and with partners. Given also the uncertainties of US further engagements in European security, the importance of capable allies in Europe taking initiatives to enhance our own capabilities is of crucial importance. For Norway, the maritime domain is of vital interest and importance. Norway is a maritime nation and, in a strategic sense, belongs to a maritime area of operations. Our coastline is one of the longest in the world, and the marine areas we manage are more than 5 times as large as our land territory. Norway has considerable maritime interests across vast ocean areas. First, a substantial share of Norwegian value creation and trade is based on our maritime sector and unhindered access to Norwegian waters and sea lanes. Second, We are a coastal state with extensive maritime zones. Our exclusive economic zone provides fisheries, energy resources, and crucial sea lines of communication. Beneath these waters lie critical undersea infrastructure. Norway hosts extensive submarine fiber optic cables, oil and gas pipelines, and power export cables to continental Europe. These arteries carry crucial data and energy. The incidents at the Nord Stream gas pipelines in September 2022 highlighted the vulnerabilities embedded in these networks, and the protection of our infrastructure all the more vital. Norway's geographical location also significantly influences Norwegian security and freedom of action. This is primarily due to our proximity to the Kola Peninsula and the extensive coastlines bordering the Barents Sea and other areas used by Russia to project sea and air power towards the west. The Barents Sea has an average depth of only 230 meters and is relatively shallow. There we can find, track and hunt submarines. The Norwegian Sea, by comparison, has an average depth of around 1,800 meters. If they get out there undetected, it is easier to find hiding places at great depths, down to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 meters. Russia has the lion's share of its maritime nuclear second strike capabilities on the Kola Peninsula. Russia's Northern Fleet holds its second strike capabilities on modernized strategic submarines, in addition to attack submarines and an increasing fleet of multi-purpose submarines armed with cruise missiles. Access to the Atlantic Ocean and the defense of nuclear capabilities are of vital importance for Russia. And in addition, Russia is introducing new and modernized surface vessels and long-range cruise missiles on different platforms. Despite Russia's significant losses elsewhere, the Northern Fleet has seen steadily increases in capability in both quantitative and qualitative terms. These developments show that Russia is increasingly thinking beyond the traditional bastion defense. And this also includes a range of assets capable of conducting work on the seabed and targeting critical infrastructure through a range of special surface vessels and deep-diving submarines. NATO and Turkey control the Bosporus Strait, so the Black Sea Fleet is cut off from the world's ocean and even oceans in the event of a major conflict. With Sweden and Finland in NATO, the Baltic Sea is surrounded by NATO, and the Gulf of Finland is easily mined in the event of a major conflict. With increasing Russian activity and Chinese ambition, the importance of the High North also increases for us and our allies. Looking ahead, we must strengthen our capabilities and preparedness. With melting ice, new sea routes are gradually opening. New actors like China are building capacity to operate in the Arctic. The quest for energy and mineral resources is intensifying, although climatic conditions and a lack of infrastructure makes commercial activity difficult. Hence, Norway's strategic interests and Norwegian advantage and vulnerabilities all point to the maritime domain. This demonstrates that our security and prosperity are inseparable from developments at sea, particularly in the High North. To Norway, the Arctic and the maritime domain are not abstract strategic concepts. It is of great importance that we can monitor and influence the security situation in the High North, including by shaping, coordinating, and participating in the increased allied activity taking place in our neighborhood. To address the demanding security situation, Norway is strengthening its defense across the board, with particular emphasis on the maritime domain in and the high north. This ambition is anchored in the long-term defense plan. Through investments in maritime surveillance, allied cooperation, host nation support, and situational awareness, Norway seeks to contribute to stability, transparency, and collective security in the Arctic. By acquiring new frigates, submarines, and standardized vessels for the Navy and the Coast Guard, we are not just replacing the Navy. We are preparing Norway's ability to advance our security interests and freedom of action. The Defense Pledge marks a significant commitment to multi-domain operations and space-based capabilities. The goal is to integrate air, land, sea, cyber, and space to increase deterrence and defense in the high north. And when we make all these major investments, it signifies a clear and firm commitment to NATO that we will do our part in the burden sharing within NATO and stand by our collective security. In doing this, increased cooperation with strategic partners is essential. First, a few words on our cooperation with our Nordic friends. Our Nordic defense cooperation is stronger than ever. In the maritime domain, it only takes a glance at the map to see how responsibility is naturally divided between our maritime forces. While Norway puts great emphasis on the Barents Sea and the Norwegian Sea, Finland and Sweden have strong maritime presence in the Baltic Sea. The geographic position of Denmark gives them a key role for security of Greenland and the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. With this geographical context in mind, we have a continuous dialogue with all Nordic countries to identify new areas of cooperation within capability development and acquisition of armaments. Adding to this, we continuously seek new opportunities for working together in securing critical undersea infrastructure. Further, through the membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO, the role of Norway within the alliance fundamentally changes. As a transit nation for reinforcement to Finland, ensuring and protecting sea lines of communication to Norwegian coast becomes even more important. In the maritime domain, our evolving strategic partnership with the UK is fundamental. The rapidly changing defense and security environments demands that we are, as close allies, are aligning common strategic priorities and considerations, and we are doing so with the UK. NATO remains the cornerstone of the defense and security. We also collaborate closely in the GEF and trilaterally with the US. Norway and the UK share strong interests in the North Atlantic and a long history of cooperation across the region. Our armed forces already cooperate very closely. Both our countries are important seafaring nations, and we have taken to the waves to trade and fight battles, typically on the same side. With the recently signed Lunna Agreement, we will operate in a seamless, integrated manner in joint areas of interests. In August 2025, my government announced the selection of the United Kingdom as strategic partner for the acquisition of new frigates. The strategic partnership involves the purchase, development, and operating of frigates jointly, and enables us to collaborate even more closely on operations, new technology, and crew training. In practice, we will have an integrated frigate fleet. We will develop the closest ever relationship between the UK Royal Navy and the Royal Norwegian Navy. I see that my time is up, so shall I continue or shall I?
Please continue.
Okay. This also includes work on exploiting the possibilities of new technology. Building on our shared experiences from the Maritime Coalition supporting Ukraine, building on the UK initiative Atlantic bastion to protect undersea cables and pipelines. The cooperation strengthens the ability of Norway and the UK and NATO to protect and monitor the maritime areas in the high north and the Atlantic. It is within this respect Defense Minister Sandvik and Defense Minister Healy signed the ambitious new defense agreement called Lunna House in December 2025. The agreement marks an important milestone in the bilateral defense and security relationship between Norway and the UK. It is the beginning of a new path of enhanced partnership and defense cooperation between our countries to promote security in NATO's northern flank and in the North Atlantic. Well, I can drop the stories about Lunna House then. Lastly, while the North Atlantic and the Arctic is a focus area for our cooperation, we are not only operating together in this region. In 2025, Norway participated in the UK-led carrier strike group deployment to the Indo-Pacific. We participated with a frigate for the whole operation and a logistic vessel during the starting phase. A British helicopter was embarked on a Norwegian frigate, which is a concrete example of interoperability. I had the opportunity to speak with the crew during my visit to Tokyo in September last year. Seamless cooperation was their core message. The operation provided the ability to train and operating in allied carrier groups and engage with partners in the Indo-Pacific. A rules-based order and freedom of navigation at sea is vital to Norway, and the deployment has demonstrated this. We also cooperate closely with the UK on support to Ukraine, in particular as co-leaders of the Maritime Capability Coalition to build Ukraine's navy. Norway remains committed to Ukraine. Working together with allies to support Ukraine amplifies our effort and helps ensure that we can meet the need of Ukraine in an effective manner. We have learned that we are stronger together, and together with the UK, we are implementing these lessons together by jointly strengthening our ability to defend and deter in our common region. I think I'll stop there then. Thank you.
Thank you, State Secretary Andreas Flåm. Please take a seat. I think we have 5 minutes to dig a little bit into what you told us, and you gave the backdrop of what we are going to discuss later today. You dropped a story from Lunna House.
Yeah.
Please tell me.
Well, no, it was back in the Second World War. The house in Shetland is quite important for the common history of Norway and the UK. And a lot of our soldiers who fought for the freedom of Norway went to this house and trained soldiers before they came back to action in Norway. So for us, it's a
symbolic place.
Absolutely, and I can tell you, I guess it's it's not a state secret, but the Brits was it's reluctant to go all the way there to sign an agreement, so it was signed in London.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to ask, in what ways do developments in the North Atlantic and the High North shape the political priorities of London and Oslo? And how do these priorities converge and diverge when translated into national policy?
It's a good question, isn't it? Well, I think it's interesting to start with the UK. We see with the Atlantic bastion concept and with the whole new concepts within the defense sector in UK, we see a shift where they have a much stronger focus on the North Atlantic than I would say before. And the same with Norway. We are a small country located where we are. So for us, the focus on the North Atlantic and the Arctic and the High North has always been our first priority. So I think the Lunna House agreements really digs into where we have common interests. So we are at a good place and at an interesting place, much more now than I would say 15 or 20 years ago.
I'm thinking we also have other bilateral relationships in the High North. I'm living on Nesodden, and the carriers that have been visiting Oslo the last 2-3 years, they are sailing into Bunnefjorden. I'm seeing them from my kitchen window. USS Gerald Ford. It's not British, it's American.
Yes.
Could you say something about the triangular cooperation in the High North with Britain and the United States, which had been increasing the last years?
Absolutely. And it really has. We have seen, if you just read the papers these days, you see a kind of there's a split, there's a transatlantic split and all that. But from us, from Norway, we have a close and even closer relationship with the UK and the US in the High North.
Exactly.
Much more now than ever before. And as you mentioned, we have carrier strikes groups this is the third year. I think you'll see even more carrier strike groups in Norwegian waters this year as well. And that's something we from Norway has really tried to gauge our closest allies, and we do see an effect on that as well. And as I mentioned, the multi-domain operations that we are carrying out in the High North are vital to us, but it is also important to the US and the UK. And for when US is focusing on their homeland defense and then the Western Hemisphere, it's no question that the Russian capabilities in the Arctic, in the Kola Peninsula, it is vital for the US to have control on what happens there, and the missiles in the Kola Peninsula it's not directed towards Oslo or Bunnefjord. it's relevant or it's much more threatening towards the American East Coast and
Exactly.
And other places in Europe.
I wonder what political mechanisms, dialogue format, parliamentary engagement, or strategic consultations are most important for ensuring that these partnerships remain adaptive and credible in a rapidly changing geopolitical context.
Well, I'm one of those. I guess that's where I come from. But I'm one of those that really is one of the believers in NATO as well. I think NATO will be there also in the future and in the long-term sense. So for us, NATO is definitely the most important organization that we are working within. Of course, we have our bilateral relationships with the UK and the US, as we mentioned, but also we are, I guess, our foreign minister mentioned this last day as well. We are working more and more closely with the EU, but for us, NATO is our main focus.
But you also mentioned the Joint Expeditionary Force, and we see a development where more and more flexible formats of cooperation, also on security and defense, is taking shape. Coalition of the willing with regard to Ukraine, as you mentioned. Do you foresee that this will increase in importance in the years to come, given that NATO is 32 different states with very different defense postures, threat perceptions, and national policies?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeff is one of those organizations that we really are quite keen on developing with the UK. It's led by the UK, and it's really fruitful for us as well. Yeah, we do see that, and yes, with the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, we have seen a lot of these groups kind of finding each other, and it's interesting to see. And I would also like to mention we spoke about Japan earlier on, and the IP4 countries.
Yeah.
Yep.
South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan.
Exactly. They are also important to participate with in this kind of relations as well. And the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific is much more closer now than ever before. We see North Korea and China supporting Russia in their war against Ukraine, which connects these countries much more to the IP4 countries to the Euro-Atlantic security as well.
We have time for a last question, and I know that you work mainly, or you have a lot of focus on Ukraine, and I would like to ask the last 2-3 weeks focus on Greenland and the whole policy of NATO now being more active in the Arctic and building up some kind of Arctic defense. Do you see this as diverting, in a way, resources, focus that should have been focused on Ukraine?
Well, yes, definitely. And by all means, I mean, Arctic security is really important. And we are glad that there is a broader focus on Arctic issues within NATO as well. This is something we from the Norwegian side have tried to develop in the NATO frame for a long time. But you're right. What happens in Ukraine is of vital importance for us, for the UK, and for the whole of Europe and the security architecture in Europe and in the world. So, yes, we should discuss Arctic security and Greenlandic security as well, but I would like to see a bit more focus on what happens in Ukraine. We, Norway, are strong supporters for Ukraine, as the UK are. This year we are spending $7 billion for military support towards Ukraine. And we do that because it's in our interest to support Ukraine. So yeah, I would like to see a lot more focus on Ukraine and not so much on Epstein and Greenland and whatever.
I think it's important to find a balance between security in the High North and also in Central Europe, and not least Ukraine, where a bloody war is going on. State Secretary Flåm, thank you so much for spending this morning with us. Give him a big applause. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my great friend and true supporter of the Oslo Security Conference, Professor Julian Lindley-French. He is, among many things, he's a friend, he's a strategist, he's an author and an expert on defense and security policy. But first and foremost, he's the chair and founder of the Alfen Group, a very good network which are discussing current security problems twice a month. He will guide you through the next panel entitled Maritime Cooperation in the North Atlantic. Please, Julian, the floor is yours and also the panel.
Thank you, Kate. Wonderful. Thank you, my friend. My fellow Norwegians, good morning, and welcome to the panel Cooperation in the North Atlantic, well, Maritime Cooperation in the North Atlantic. Let me first introduce my very august panel before we get down to business. First, I'd like to welcome to the podium Rear Admiral Oliver Berdal, Chief of the Royal Norwegian Navy. Oliver, please. Great. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Then Major General Richard Cantrell of the Royal Marines and Commander of Operations Royal Navy. Richard, please. Great, good to see you. Katarzyna Zisk, Professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defence Studies. Katarzyna, lovely to see you. Thank you very much. And last but not least, I shall try to get this right, Sten Running, Director of the Danish Institute of Advanced Study, Professor of War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. Before we get down to business, let me frame our discussion. Kate rightly called this conference about the new normal in transatlantic relations. Well, I would characterize the new normal, if it exists, as the capacity of our political leaders to face reality, and not the old normal, which was to recognize only as much threat as we could afford. That is the fundamental imperative which will define whether we are in a new normal or continue in a pretend old normal, which has exaggerated the threats that we face. And if we are to do this, we have to consider the worst case. We have to plan for the worst case. And the worst case is an emergency, a war, in which the United States is forced to have the bulk of its forces and resources in the Indo-Pacific, facing multiple engineered crises the world over that China and Russia would engineer, in which the Russians are applying pressure in this region as the Chinese are applying pressure elsewhere. I'm just finishing a new book called Future War in the Pacific with Generals Hodges, Allen and Ryan from the Australian Army. And I can tell you the Chinese way of war, we do not understand in Europe. But the Chinese way of war is to use technology to fight a long, not a short war. A war in which we Europeans will need to be responsible for security and defence in and around Europe. Now, the worst case, therefore, is that moment when our military command structures are under intense pressure from an enemy, a prepared enemy, in a very big space with very, very advanced technology. That's the worst case. When we come to talk about maritime cooperation in the North Atlantic, let us be clear what the North Atlantic is. It begins in the Azores. Look at a map. It begins in the Azores and it goes to the Barents Sea. And it goes across to Canada and North America. This is a very, very big space indeed. So what we're really talking about this morning, and what I really want to get a sense of, are whether relatively small forces, in the absence of the United States, the forced absence rather than chosen absence of the United States, whether we can indeed mount a defence that would preserve lines of supply and resupply across the Atlantic and deny an adversary what they want to do. I take point with one of the points that my distinguished colleague, the State Secretary, just said. This is close to my heart. My grandfather fought at the Battle of North Cape. He was in Burnett's Force 1, covering Atlantic convoys into Murmansk during World War II. He saw a lot of his friends killed in the North Atlantic. And of course, at the time, the Royal Norwegian Navy was a very, very close partner of the Royal Navy. In fact, the ship that delivered the coup de grace to the Scharnhorst in December 1943 was the Norwegian destroyer Stord as part of Force 2 under Admiral Fraser. So this is a long story of collaboration between our two countries. But the essential point that we will have to raise and address today is, are we up to the challenge implicit in this new strategic partnership, not just between the UK and Norway, but all Europeans in what is going to be an increased responsibility in an enormous area of responsibility. With that in mind, let me move to the opening statements. I'll invite Oliver and Richard to speak for 10 minutes. I'll hold you to those 10 minutes. 9 minutes, I'll give you a stern warning that you have to wrap up. Katarzyna and Sten will then respond with 5 minutes each before we develop the discussion in a panel. So without further ado, Oliver, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you want me here or do you want me up?
Wherever you want to go.
Well, I'll stand up for a couple of minutes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you. I have to admit that as a simple sailor from the west coast of Bergen, it's my first time in this beautiful building. It's also my first time at this beautiful and very interesting conference. The most interesting thing that happened to me today was actually walking up here this morning, walking up the main street of Oslo, facing the castle, and on the right side, walking up Karl Johan, the parade street of Norway, there was a big car shop selling electric vehicles from China. And it's not the only car shop here in Oslo. There are several of them, and I think no one in the audience, no one would have expected that 10 to 15 years ago. So the rise of China has happened gradually, but it has happened fast, and it's quite impressive. At the moment, China produces, it's got approximately 35% of global industrial production, and it's going to increase. They produce 40% of all cars on the planet. It's going to increase, but I'm not here to talk about cars. They produce more than 50% of all ships produced on the planet. They produce more warships than the combined West do together. They are world-leading in academic research and in scientific research and also publishing of scientific reports. They had a trade surplus last year of $1,200 billion, which is basically almost half of the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. And the list is long. I'm not going to spend much time talking about China, but Julian, you challenged me. Is China going to affect the sea lines of communication across the North Atlantic? And my short answer to that is, in the short run, no. In the medium term, no. But they are going to profoundly impact everything else. But when it comes to the North Atlantic, the interior lines and the nations bordering the North Atlantic, we're all on the same team, all on the same, basically, as part of the same alliance. And I think that will continue because it's in our mutual interests. So I think that China is not going to pose any major threat in this part of the world. And I'm not going to talk about the rest of it, because you're probably going to do that later today. However, Norway's next-door neighbor, Russia, has been there for a long time, is going to continue to be there in the future, and is still our biggest headache. And that is going to continue. And the most challenging part with Russia when it comes to the naval domain is they have always invested heavily in undersea capabilities, such as submarines, and they're quite good at building stealthy submarines. So the submarine threat from Russia towards NATO, towards the sea lines of communication crossing the Atlantic, will continue to be there. The other main challenge that I see from the Russian side is that they are quite good at making missiles. They make a lot of different missiles, and they produce them in quite large numbers, and that also poses a significant threat to our nations if we ever get into conflict. However, we live in deep peace. Or do we? I think that we will continue to see Russia challenging us in all the areas where we are weak, which at sea means basically hybrid warfare, gray zone challenges, using the shadow fleet, poking us, potentially training to affect our critical infrastructure, seabed infrastructure, and all other ways that they can show us that they can keep our societies at risk and also create a lot of problems for us if they want to. Should we be afraid of Russia? I don't think so. I think it's time for us to regain some self-esteem. We still have the most powerful alliance this planet has ever seen. It works. Yes, I know that there are some clouds on the horizon. There's plenty of challenges. But I think that for all the NATO members, staying in the alliance in some kind of form or fashion will give so much more advantages than disadvantages. And as long as we can stay together in some shape or form, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for Russia to really challenge us. They don't have the numbers. They don't have the industrial capacity. They don't have the Navy. They don't have the industrial or technological base. They don't have the ports or bases that they will need. They will have extremely long transit times. Their endurance will be shorter, etc., etc. So I think that NATO has so many advantages that we will be able to continue to deter Russia. But it won't happen by itself. We need to strengthen our societies. We need to be mentally prepared for challenges, and we also need to strengthen European defenses significantly. And that process is ongoing. For Norway, as a maritime nation, being the world's largest seafood exporter, setting new records of export every year, being the most important supplier of natural gas to Europe at the moment, about 30% of the natural gas need of the European Union and Great Britain, making us the fourth largest gas exporter on the planet, and also with Norwegian ship owners controlling about 7% of the global shipping fleet, making us the fifth largest shipping fleet in the world. We are definitely a maritime nation. However, we are not a large military nation. With only 5.6 million people, we heavily depend on friends and allies, and it's very important for Norway to cooperate as closely as we can with allies. And one of the areas where Europe really needs to get their act together is when it comes to armaments and making sure that we can get more economies of scale and synergies between nations. That's one of the reasons why Norway several years ago decided to build identical submarines together with Germany. Identical. There's not many nations around that do that. I still haven't found any. But we are trying, and we will succeed. And it's also one of the reasons why the Norwegian government, in the fall last year, decided to do the exact same when it came to the UK, building identical frigates in the UK as the Royal Navy is doing right now. And if I have the numbers right, Richard, I think 5 frigates are in building, and number 6 is just around the corner, right? Which means that the first Norwegian frigate will start its building weeks or months from now. So we're moving fast. But I think it's time that we wake up to the realities around us. The main purpose of our armed forces is not to fight the war, it's to avoid war. And the only way that we can be sure that we, as Norwegians and as Europeans, and with our allies, Canada and the US, and I also would include Australia, Japan, South Korea, and some others, is to fully understand that this is unfortunately a time where we need to spend more money on rearming, and we also need to spend more time in our societies of discussing the challenging things. Because it doesn't only help to have a strong military, we also need to have a strong and robust society. And I'm very glad to see that 2026 has been named the year of the total defense in Norway. So all government sectors now, from health, police, etc., are focusing on this. I think it's important because our robustness as a society is keeping us together, and collective approaches. That's what makes us strong, both as a nation and also within the alliance. Am I concerned about the future? Yes. Am I afraid about the future? No. And I think we should stop being afraid. I would once again bring up self-esteem. I think that we need to trust the things that we're doing right now. We need to trust the decisions made by our politicians to rearm in Europe.
1 minute, please, Oliver.
I'll finish by time.
Good man.
Yeah. I think we just need to realize that this is a time where we need to be serious, where we need to make decisions, and we need to follow up on those decisions. And if we do that, and are able to keep the alliance together, I'm not afraid about the Russians, and I think that we will be able to safeguard Norway, Europe, and the whole alliance for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you very much, sir. Great. So, Richard, the British perspective, please. Sir, 10 minutes.
Julian, thank you Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here to share the stage with you all and to represent the Royal Navy. And I'd just observe, Kate, yesterday I thought was a superb day. Some very strategic discussions, but I should be clear that in my daily work, I'm operating at the operational level and the tactical level. So I'll try and stay out of strategy, and hopefully a practitioner's view from my role from the UK might be useful. Just to be clear on my role, because it maybe doesn't leap out from my rank or from my bio, is that whilst I'm a Royal Marine, I have the great privilege at the moment of commanding the ready elements of all 5 fighting arms of the Royal Navy, so submarines, surface ships, fleet air arm, auxiliaries, and the commando force. And that is an incredible privilege, and if you want to ask me how I do it from our UK Maritime Ops Centre in Northwood, I'd be happy to share. I think I only do 2 things, by the way, back in Northwood. I'll tell you what they are if you ask me afterwards. But let me reflect on why the North Atlantic matters so much to us. And what I'll do is I'll start personal, national, parochial, and then maybe build out to alliance, if that's helpful. At the heart of my role is every day to operate and defend our nuclear deterrent. And that keeps my mind very focused, and it keeps us very busy. And because we are deploying an SSBN into waters from the UK, then operational advantage in the North Atlantic is pivotal. Because we want that submarine to remain undetected, invulnerable, and to offer deterrence and choice to our political decision makers, both nationally and NATO, because our nuclear deterrent is declared to NATO. So at the very heart of why I care about the North Atlantic is a lonely SSBN deployed, undetected, very slowly. But there's another layer on top of that, of course, and there are a range of threats that the State Secretary mentioned which threaten our homeland, the British Isles, and the homelands of all our allies surrounding the North Atlantic. And they were mentioned earlier. The Northern Fleet has sophisticated submarines that can deploy into the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic, south of the gaps, and they have a land attack capability. And in the UK, it's no secret that we don't have a golden dome, a sophisticated integrated air and missile defense. And so to treat that risk, to mitigate that risk, we need to do that forward at sea and ensure that we have advantage in the North Atlantic and the adversary does not. But there are other concerns and threats that the State Secretary also mentioned. There are seabed warfare threats from the Russian underwater reconnaissance program, or GUGI, with both ships and submarines that can threaten our critical undersea infrastructure, and that's great concern to us. But also, and we discussed this a little bit yesterday, is it's not just those specialist threats to our CUI, there are more non-conventional threats. So the rusty cargo ship dragging its anchor and damaging a cable, and it could be that other hybrid threats emanate from the so-called shadow fleet. And there's a very live topic back in London at the moment about how we might do more to treat that risk. So every day I'm thinking about my very national nuclear deterrent concern and seeking operational advantage for that purpose. I'm also thinking about our contribution to homeland defence. But then there is a further layer beyond that, and the further layer beyond that is that NATO has a plan, in fact a range of plans, and we won't discuss them here, Saka would tell me off. And you would imagine that freedom of action, sea control in the North Atlantic is fundamental to those plans, and of course it is. Because what we want to be able to do is to move our striking forces and our littoral forces where we want to move them, and we want to ensure that our sea lines of communication for resupply and reinforcement are absolutely guaranteed. So that's all I've done there is state the obvious about the importance of the North Atlantic. But if I digress just slightly, I think that sort of discussion goes to the heart of what navies are for and what the Royal Navy does. And arguably, the Royal Navy and the Norwegian Navy do lots of things, but maybe there are 2 things that we really do. The first is that we protect our national interests at sea. And for an island nation like the UK, where we bring in quite a lot of food, a lot of fuel, and masses of data every day, then we must protect our interests at sea. But the flip side of that, the second thing is we must exploit the freedoms of the maritime domain to get after our national and alliance objectives, because there is opportunity in the maritime domain, and that opportunity is certainly baked into the NATO family of plans. But if that's why the North Atlantic is important, what do we do about it? And what are the challenges and the opportunities there, particularly if there is less US attention in that water space? And, speaking frankly, I think we expected over this year and last year to see a bit less US force flow in the North Atlantic because of a pivot towards the Indo-Pacific. What we didn't necessarily see coming at all was that US destroyers would be in the Caribbean Sea off Venezuela rather than in the gaps. That's been a bit of a surprise. The challenges of the North Atlantic are really obvious, and Julian's introduced some of them. It's a vast scale. There's a lot of water space there. It's a massive maritime flank for our nations and for NATO. And so there's something about size and span there. The environment is unfriendly. I get routine briefs on the weather in the UK mock every week, and I wince when I'm told that there are currently 9 to 11 metre swells in the Ice and Faroe gaps, because I know we may need to deploy a towed array frigate into that area. We also know that to operate against the adversary in the North Atlantic needs quite specialist, quite high-end capabilities, and that can be difficult and expensive and takes years to develop. And what's interesting is that, in the rest of the military domains, electromagnetism is key. That is where you're operating, in the electromagnetic, whereas in much of the North Atlantic, we're operating in the acoustic, which is much more specialist and less people do it. And then, of course, there are a whole range of sensitive capabilities and intelligence that underpin our ability to have advantage in the North Atlantic, and we need to guard them carefully and operate carefully together and protect those. But what are the opportunities, and how do we deal with those challenges? Well, to cut to the chase and give you a single line answer, it's intense cooperation with very serious partners. And that's what the Lunna Agreement is about. It's about interchangeable capabilities. It's about a fleet of Type 26 between UK and Norway, a very similar variant based on the same design from Canada, working with French and German vessels with similar capabilities and interchangeable. And so the amazing future of Type 26 is that there is a problem, we're going to apply a Type 26 to it. Is it UK ship? Is it Norwegian ship? It doesn't matter. Right, the following ship has a defect. Where's it going to go? Is it going to go to Tromsø or is it going to go to Faslane? It doesn't matter. Where is the helicopter? It doesn't matter. And that level of interchangeability, I think, allows us to deal with the scale and complexity and get after the adversary and have advantage, which is really important. And the same is true of the queen on the chessboard in the air, which is the P8. Maritime patrol aircraft allow you to deal with that scale. And what we're soon going to see is an arc of NATO P8s from the US and Canada through Norway and the UK down to Germany. And that's considerable and really game-changing. And then the final bit I'll mention is, and it was mentioned slightly earlier, is the ongoing Royal Navy transformation towards more of a hybrid Navy. And what that means is augmenting our sophisticated capabilities and platforms, SSNs, Type 26, Type 45s, and so on, with a wider range of autonomous systems. And why is that important?
1 minute, please, Richard.
Why is that important? Well, first, Sea Lord wants us to be crewed where necessary, uncrewed where we can be, because, again, that allows us to deal with the scale and the range of the problem, particularly if not all our allies are able to contribute at the normal rate. Now, this might seem like, a sort of promise for tomorrow. Well, yeah, but you haven't got these autonomous capabilities yet, Rich. Well, it is a promise for tomorrow, but it's not a 25-year program of record defense, standard defense procurement promise. It is adding autonomous systems as soon as they're available. And so this year, we are going to put Atlantic Bastion capabilities into the water. And we're just saying to industry, we want to have autonomous submarine sense and please decide how you want to do it. And we're getting a whole range of different capability offers to support us, and I think that's really important. But it comes down to deep cooperation with serious partners, and I'm really proud to be alongside our very serious partner today. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Katarzyna, your response to this?
Well, so my remarks, introductory remarks, will focus on the question of what threat the Russian forces pose to the Arctic, the North Atlantic, and how strong the Northern Fleet actually is. And I will make 3 points. So the first is that, surprisingly, the Arctic and the High North actually remained quite central focus in Moscow, despite the enormous cost of the war. The Kremlin has actually maintained quite a lot of attention. We've seen that in the speeches made by Putin, by the defense ministers. It was reflected in the Russian strategic documents, and also in relatively high military activity still in the region. And why does it matter? Well, this is, first of all, because the Northern Fleet is the core part of the Russian strategic deterrence force still. And you've heard all about that, the Northern Fleet has lost around 80% of land forces that are deployed in the region. They were sent to Ukraine, which has led, in fact, to decline in combat effectiveness, in maintenance. It has reduced some operations, but these losses affect primarily the land domain, and the region is primarily about the air and maritime domain. And in fact, this force has pretty much remained intact, which gives Russia the capacity for escalation and coercion. So, in addition to that, as we just heard, actually the Northern Fleet is continuing to be strengthened. There are new submarines that are joining the Northern Fleet, the SSBNs of the Bory class, Yasen multi-role, the newest, the most modern Russian multi-role submarines. And also, there are 3 Gorshkov-class frigates that are on the way also to strengthen the Russian Navy. They have air defense, anti-ship, anti-submarine warfare capabilities. They're equipped with the Zircon missiles. So, in addition, Russia also continues to test the Poseidon underwater vehicle, the Burevestnik cruise missile, nuclear-capable, nuclear-driven. So, in addition to all of that, it is fact that Russia faces severe problems, economic, industrial. So there are constraints, but I think it is important to highlight that even partially reconstituted Russian forces will still pose a significant threat to NATO, and in particular in the European theater. And what is also important to highlight when we talk about this part of the region is that it is closely interconnected with other security spaces. We've seen that time and again. When Russia sends their forces, it was already since 2014, the forces from the High North to Ukraine, of course during the full-scale invasion, in the way Russia disperses strategic bombers, on the Olenia airbase, from where Russia has been conducting regular attacks on Ukraine. So obviously, if there will be a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO, this region will be immediately affected. So the third point I would make is that the Northern Fleet matters because the Kremlin has also few remaining options to shape the Western decision-making. And this is also, of course, because the war drains resources, it drains the economy. So what Russia has is the nuclear domain, which Putin still uses for what it's good for, and of course the attacks that are happening alongside in the gray zone, which this is likely to persist and prevail over coercion.
1 minute, please. 1 minute, please.
And so I think even if Russia were to agree to a ceasefire, and that's of course a significant if, it will not end the broader war that Russia will continue waging against NATO and against European countries. And this is because Putin's obsession with some of the main goals it remains, which is to establish the Russian-dominated sphere of influence in Europe and reshape the international order to Russia's advantage. And this aim, it is something that happens or should be seen in the context of the influence that security and military agencies have on the Russian foreign policy. So this, in my view, makes lasting peace unlikely. So the confrontation Russia is preparing for, it will be long-lasting, long-term. And I have a few other points, but I will save them for later.
Thank you, Katarzyna. That's very kind of you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Sten, Denmark's rather been in the front line of things in recent weeks. How do you see it?
Well, thank you, Julian. And on this panel on maritime cooperation, of course, I'm designated as the speaker on territorial confrontation. So I don't know how that fits, but we'll make it fit, Julian. I think I can summarize my presentation as no, no, and no. And the first no is that this is not over. The Danish-Greenland conflict with the United States is not over. It began brutally in mid-January last year, 2025, in a 45-minute telephone conversation between the Danish Prime Minister and the US President. It was, I think, a remarkable experience for the Danish Prime Minister. She came away, I haven't seen the transcript, but I've heard enough about it to know that it was, let's say, a very frank exchange where the US President didn't mince his words. Ever since then, Denmark has known that this could explode in their hands, and it did last month. It's now on diplomatic life support in NATO and in the bilateral dialogue between the Kingdom and the Republic. But don't expect that that is the end of it. It could come back, it could work out. It's not over. No, this is not about security. The assessment that I'm able to gather from speaking to people in NATO or in Denmark or in countries close to Denmark is that there is no threat to Greenland. Maybe long term, maybe there are some issues, radar coverage or something like this, but there's no urgency. There are no Chinese ships circling around Greenland. This is about presidential prestige and the personal preference of that one person, President Trump. It is linked to his person and to his own agenda, which makes it very volatile and very difficult to navigate. You cannot easily structure a policy process, a diplomatic negotiation around something that is that personal, and who speaks for the president except the president. So that leads me to my third no, which is no, this is not about a continuation of US hemispheric interest. It is not about interest in that sense. The US was always capable of defining its hemispheric interest in a way that was compatible with international order. It was a little bit dynamic. It wasn't always beautiful. But they managed the balancing act. Theodore Roosevelt, he wanted international order on debt repayment. That's why he did his intervention policy, the corollary. Woodrow Wilson, who allowed Denmark to have sovereignty over Greenland as he purchased the West Indies Islands. He wanted the Monroe Doctrine to be compatible with his League of Nations. The hemisphere and international order and Danish presence were compatible. Same with Roosevelt during World War II. At a time when Denmark was occupied after a long, heroic Danish defense against Germany, I think it lasted 6 hours. Yeah. The concern was in North America, Iceland and Greenland are now open because Germany has Denmark. Canada wanted to move in, but for the US, Canada was a little bit too European. They were concerned about what Japan would do in the Dutch East Indies. And finally they said, we have to do it, but we cannot do it because we're not at war. As a neutral country, what do? We strike a deal with Denmark that recognizes Danish sovereignty. That was compatible. The hemispheric defense, international order, and Denmark. What we're living through now is different. It's about domination, it's about personal interest of the president, and it's rough going. And as I said, it's not over. There are 3 principles Denmark has pursued. It'll take 20 seconds, Julian, I beg your pardon. But since that famous phone call last year, number 1 has been, don't send the Danish Prime Minister to Washington because she will have to kiss the ring. She's not going. Second, don't get into a street fight with Trump because he'll win it. So stay low, work the corridors, not the social media. Third, get the allies on board and prepare for this because it could blow up. We now have an agreement, but it's not an agreement until it's signed. And it could still blow up. But for Denmark, I think the problem is that this could blow up, but we're also taxing on allied patience because the security problem is elsewhere. It's in the Bear Gap, it's in a different part of the Arctic. And so we're back to this personal preference of the president and his will to dominate. And I'm just not confident that we have seen the end of it.
Thank you, Sten. I mean, that's a very important statement, and I think it encapsulates what I'm going to ask you to do now, which we'll have a discussion on all the issues that we've raised with a series of questions that I want to pose to you. But I want to put the takeaways from this initial engagement to you all. What I'm hearing is change, quite profound change taking place in our assumptions, but also the unexpected. The unexpected has been President Trump and his position. I would argue that that's driven by deeper American pressures, deeper overstretch of American forces. And therefore, the question that will frame everything we discuss next is this. Okay, imagine the worst case, that we Europeans have to defend a very large area of responsibility with limited or minimal American involvement. How would we go about doing that? How would we go about achieving a credible deterrence, first of all, that convinces the Kremlin specifically that it's not worth the risk, and then mount a credible defense as Europeans? I've just published a major new paper with Jim Townsend and John Allen, called Super Jeff, the Super Joint Expeditionary Force. It's brilliant and very reasonably priced and available on all good websites. And we argue that not only is this a plausible risk, but it would require the complete reorganization of allied nations in Europe. For example, the Brits, the idea of us putting 2 divisions in support of land ops in the east, forget it. Can't do it now. We'd have to focus on the high north, on the North Atlantic, with Norway and other allies. So, given the nature of this change, what I first want to understand, and given the importance of the North Atlantic, are we up to the possible worst-case scenarios which have been implied or indeed painted in this introductory discussion? Oliver.
I think if you look at numbers, and if you do a match of red and blue, to put it that way, we are far superior. But numbers alone don't matter. It's what's beneath the numbers.
Yeah.
So what is the actual status of the Russian Northern Fleet? How many ships can actually sail? How many ships are trained? Do they have all the armaments, the equipment, etc.? So I think if you start doing the numbers, and I'm only talking for the naval part of it, I think that, yes, we can protect ourselves. If you look at the developments going on now with the ongoing rearmament of European nations, the total capability, both when it comes to space, when it comes to maritime patrol aircraft, when it comes to surface vessels and submarines, we outnumber the Russians, even without the Americans. And another thing is if you look at the North Atlantic when it comes to bases, it's a huge area. And for the Russians to get there, it's a long, long way. And we've got all the advantages. We've got all the land, we've got all the ports, we've got all the bases, etc. And if you look at the Baltic Sea, nothing is going to get in or out from the Baltic Sea if we, as an alliance, decide to close it down. So I think that if I'd been sitting in Moscow, I mean, you don't stand a chance.
Yeah.
They've been spending almost 4 years now of trying to invade Ukraine, and in 2025 alone, how much more land did they take? Was it 1% or was it less? A couple of percent. I mean, and then you're going to start chewing on the rest? I don't see it coming. Having said that, we have to take Russia seriously because their weapons industry is running at high speed. They're producing drones in the thousands every month, missiles in the hundreds, etc. They are clearly rearming, and we have to rearm as well. Not to fight, but to make sure that they perceive us as a credible alliance, and that we also have a credible deterrent. It's as simple as that.
Richard, let's assume that the Russians launch a information war, a decapitation war, a cyber war, in conjunction to the use of force. To what extent would your assumptions be affected if Russian forces took the North Cape, Bear Island, Svalbard? Oliver's rightly pointed out the problems that the Northern Fleet faces. And the Northern Fleet is central, as Katarzyna said, to Russian strategic capabilities and objectives. So how much would such a démarche affect your assumptions and your planning?
Roger, and I will definitely answer your question, but I would just like to challenge gently the premise that a worst-case scenario sees us Europeans alone. And the reason I mention that is if you think about how I explained how I think about North Atlantic, starting national homeland defense, moving up to alliance, of course, my US counterpart will think in the same way. And so even if the US were very focused on a hot war in the Indo-Pacific, it still needs to defend its own eastern seaboard, and it knows that the other adversary might take advantage. And so I think we should assume that in all scenarios there will be a baseline level of US capability which is concerned about the North Atlantic. And that's kind of reassuring, but it will be important because, you know, Sagaris missiles landing on Washington would not be a preference. But to come back to your point about, you know, how would we deal or respond to, you know, a sort of a hybrid war which, you know, sees seizure of Norwegian territory? Well, my proposition is that we would be as far ahead of it as we could be. And I'll give an example of the direction that our First Seal Order has given to our commando force in recent months. You know, we redesigned our traditional amphibious infantry brigade into a more modern commando force. And the idea 3 or 4 years ago was that we would have littoral response groups, more forward, more ready to respond, one east of Suez, one west of Suez. Well, that's gone now, already. The First Seal Order said, double down the commando force to the high north. And right now we have twice the numbers of commandos up in the high north with Norwegian partners than we did last year. And if you speak to the commander of commando force, who has a role in protecting our nuclear deterrent in and around Faslane, he sees his role as, my role is from Faslane to Murmansk. And that's how he sees it. And so where would the commando force be if there was an inkling of challenge? They would be alongside their Norwegian counterparts in the high north. Because, you know, I grew up training in Norway. We sort of, over time, got better at training with Norway. Now we're just rehearsing a plan. and Admiral Runa and Admiral Oliver are kind of central to that. And then we would wish to be active in the maritime. And there are plenty of things that we can't really talk about in an environment such as this, but I think we have reasons to be optimistic about our operational advantage. And I'm absolutely with Admiral Oliver in that, it's not necessarily about numbers. It is about capability and understanding. And I think we would act. And what's been really promising for me over the last year is to see how our UK defence ministers are so intent on being really assertive. And so the Yantar, as an example, Yantar is not a major threat. Some might argue this is a RERP surface vessel, but our ministers are not tolerating it to act freely anywhere near the UK. And I think that's where we are. I'll probably leave it there.
Thank you, Richard. Katarzyna, Russians aren't going to do what we want them to do. And they are not stupid, as you know. In any pre-war emergency, they will, of course, deploy their forces to best advantage. So much of the Northern Fleet will be out in the North Atlantic. How convinced are you by Richard that we could maintain operational advantage in the early stages of conflict, at the very least?
That's a very important precision, the early stages of conflict, because that's exactly where the Russian doctrine for a long time has highlighted this is the most important. And I think their terrible experience in Ukraine just confirmed that it was actually, because they lost the first stage of war in Ukraine, and as they say, this affects the rest of the conflict. So I think it depends what kind of scenario we are talking about. It is not only the question of comparing the forces statically. It depends whether, for instance, we will be standing together. And as you say, Russians are not stupid, and I think they would not be equally suicidal as they were in Ukraine. Of course, they were not planning for the war they were fighting in Ukraine, but I think they would not estimate, as they did, underestimate NATO the same way they underestimated Ukraine. So I think we have to be careful what kind of conclusions we are drawing from the experiences from the war in Ukraine. And I think we have to also remember that, and we haven't talked about it yet, is that the Russian, if they would decide or go for direct confrontation with NATO, they would have to have a fair certainty based on two major aspects. The first is their assessment that NATO would not be able to respond collectively. And the second, of course, it is the fact that Russia would like to maintain escalation dominance with the use of theater nuclear weapons. And we have to talk about that. How do we address this problem? Yep. And it is, of course, it is heavily dependent also on the US and the credibility of the US guarantee. So I think, again, it depends what kind of scenario we are talking about. The first phase of the conflict would be indeed decisive, and as Russians highlight, critical infrastructure would be very much one of the first targets. We have mentioned Gugi, we have mentioned the main director of deep sea research, and the offensive capabilities they have developed over decades, in addition, of course, to the civilian capacities and capabilities that Russians are using. The maritime doctrine clearly highlight that. The Russian maritime doctrine highlight that they will be using commercial ships if necessary in a conflict situation. So I think it's not an easy and straightforward answer to this question. It really depends.
Thank you, Sten. Taking Katarzyna's point raises a further question about the contiguous nature of the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. We have a new Northern Sea passage possibly opening over the next 10, 20 years because of global warming. That changes the strategic assumptions again. To what extent do you believe that we have to plan beyond the North Atlantic, if you like, given that the very fundamentals of how Russia sees what is important to Russia is changing?
Well, it's an emerging reality. So we'll have to address it and reflect on it. And that's a very vague answer. But I think where Russia is it's both oriented towards the Arctic, but it's fighting a war in Central Europe. That's where its core territorial interest is. And we haven't seen the Russia consummate a reorientation of its traditional geopolitics. It remains a core European power with a core revisionist agenda that concerns Central Europe. And I think you pointed this out, Julian, that Britain does not have two divisions to deploy to Central Europe to help secure that area. It will increasingly have to be focused on the North Atlantic and into the Arctic and the issues that you raise here. And so I think my answer to your question will be, Europeans will have to be more upfront and smarter about how they can divide the labor. And there's a pretense today, there's an uncertainty today, who is going to secure Central Europe? And who can then afford to look to the Arctic, and how does that combine? I think it's just fundamentally not clear who's going to do what. When I look at the coalition of the willing that is supposedly to help guarantee Ukraine after a settlement of some sorts, it's France and Britain. But that's not credible. They don't have the conventional capacity, as you said. And it will increasingly have to be Germany. And so how that works out, we'll have to see. But I think it's in very early days for that type of division of labor in Europe. I think you're raising the right question, Julian, but I think the political reality is some ways behind it.
That's what concerns me, Sten. That, you know, frankly, and to be blunt, because I'm a Yorkshireman and I am, the NATO defence planning process is one of the great works of European fiction. The gap between what Saka thinks he has in the war plan and what actually would be delivered by European allies in extremis is dangerously wide. Not least because of the nature of technologies that are entering into the battle space and will accelerate into the battle space. And then we have an additional problem, which is Russia is rapidly developing the same relationship with China that Britain has with the Americans. That it is essentially Beijing that will decide whether Russia goes to war or not, in line with Beijing's strategic objectives in the Indo-Pacific, and instrumentalize the Russians to stretch the Americans thin. And in that sense, we Europeans cannot afford to be a drain on the Americans. We have to change Chinese and Russian assumptions about power by being an autonomous capability that can defend ourselves as first responders in the worst case. And yes, I'm hearing good things from all of you about what's happening, that we are improving, but I don't see the ends, ways and means of credible deterrence and defence as yet balanced. I'm going to come back to that with you all so that we can finish off the panel with a question about ends, ways and means. What do we do next? But I want to give the chance for the audience via this amazing bit of technology, Kate, if there's any questions even better. Let's go the analog route, which I can cope with. Who would like to ask a question? Sir, can we have a microphone down the front, please? Well, adapt and adjust.
That guy is surprising me.
Adapt and adjust, the key requisite. Sir.
Well, thank you again. And I think excellent panel. And Admiral, I'm a big fan of yours, so thank you again for your outstanding remarks. I would take one exception, build up on what Mr. French said. You are rightly to say that Russia, as it is, may not be a threat. You've got them covered. Yesterday, we heard from our good friend, Keir Giles, that there is actually a Russian coalition at effect in Ukraine and obviously an American coalition. And Russia has played a game where it said NATO was its biggest enemy, and in fighting NATO, it had become a subservient power to China, which actually would maybe be a bigger enemy, and Europe may go down that way on China as well, but that's a different issue. So when we look at Arctic, a lot of the questions here have been Russia's capability. I do want to
question short, please.
Yeah, I want to push up on French's point on Russia-Chinese capability, not just on missiles, not only on various frigates or submarines. So with that capability and with that push, what would be the scenario, again, to come back to your point, but whether you have ways, means, and ability to do it. So this China angle has been missing in this stuff, and if it was taken to the worst-case scenario, so you've played a worst-case scenario of us fighting in the Pacific, but the worst-case scenario of China basically telling Russia what to do in the high north and be able to do it, what would that be the answer to that? That would be nice to know. Thanks.
Thank you. Oliver.
Well, even though there's a bromance between Putin and Xi Jinping, I do think that they have some diverging interests as well. I mean, many people have been speculating about the Russians letting the Chinese use their bases, for instance, on the Kola Peninsula. I think we are many years away from that happening for many reasons. Also, even though climate change is real and the Arctic ice is gradually melting, it's still a very inhospitable area. So it's not an area where you can operate warships on the surface most of the years. Even when the Russians are doing patrols in high north, they need icebreakers in September when the ice is at its minimum. So I think that for the coming decade or two, I don't think we will see any major challenges on the surface. However, of course, as Chinese submarines gradually are becoming better, there might be submarine patrols up in the Arctic, but the Chinese still have a way to go in that area as well. So I don't think that's going to be the biggest concern. I think China is going to devote their resources to making sure that they have total control in the Indo-Pacific, and that's going to be their first ambition, and then that's going to take some time, and they will probably expand from there. But no.
Richard?
I played my card early that I don't get involved in strategy necessarily, but I do have an opinion. I mean, my opinion is firmly aligned with Admiral Oliver's, I think. What we are seeing is a massive growth in the Chinese Navy. It's incredible. I think between 2019 and 2023, the Chinese Navy grew in surface fleet a whole Royal Navy's amount. I mean, that probably says more about the small size of the Royal Navy, but they're in a sort of exponential growth at the moment. But we simply aren't seeing them capitalize on that to be that near Arctic power that they've spoken of. Is it a concern for the future? Absolutely. Is there a complex, maybe client relationship between the two nations? I'm sure there is, but one to watch. Nothing more to add.
Katarzyna.
I would largely agree with Admiral Berdal that there is this inbuilt ambiguity in this relationship. It's a long-standing, especially in the Russian security and defense established, there's a lot of concern about the multi-million army growing across the border. But the reality is that the relationship has evolved significantly, not only in particular since 2022, but also we've seen the progress since 2014, when the qualitative change in this relationship with Russia selling more sensitive military technology, opening in markets, of course, and that has accelerated since 2022. And so when we look at the Arctic, yes, China, there is actually an interesting study Harvard has mapped all the investments China wanted to make in the Arctic. Turns out there is not that much that they managed to do. But the reason for that is that because they got a lot of pushback. And I think the map shows not only what they didn't manage to do, but also what they wanted to do and the scale of an ambition that China has had. And I think this has not completely disappeared. There are constraints, but Russia is that door opener for China in the Arctic. And what I've been surprised about is certain steps taken by Russia and China, and the willingness of Russia to put the Arctic card on the table, as demonstrated by the memorandum of understanding that was signed by the Coast Guard, Chinese Coast Guard, and the FSB, Russian FSB, which potentially opens for security dimension in this cooperation in the Arctic. And another one which really surprised me is that Russia opened when Xi Jinping visited Moscow. Putin said we can actually perhaps create a body to jointly manage the Northern Sea route. Russia has been so sensitive about sovereignty, about the national control of the Northern Sea route, and yet they open up for cooperation. And so we said, okay, we will see what will happen. And actually, 2024, they started operationalizing this cooperation. So I think, yes, there is caution, but also steps that are concerning and to be closely followed.
Sten, let me explain what I disagree with Oliver and Richard on this. A defence planning cycle traditionally is 10 to 15 years. If you project forward to 2040 and beyond, just beyond, and you look at the technology trends that both the Americans and the Chinese are developing, and I'm looking at the Eastern Theatre Command of the Chinese PLA and what they're doing there, the role of artificial general intelligence, a whole host of other hypersonic systems, biosystems, cyber systems in multi-domain operations. And I'm looking at two countries which are driving a genuine revolution in the character of warfare. And that revolution will impact in places like the North Atlantic and the Arctic in the decade or so to go. But I'm seeing nothing but an analog plus development in Europe. I'm hearing talk of it, but I'm seeing nothing like the investment, the defense technological and industrial adaptation required to even maintain interoperability with the high-end US future force in 10, 15 years' time. I wonder whether we'll be able to maintain that interoperability at the high end of conflict. Mm-hmm. What do you think Europeans must do as a minimum to maintain a credible deterrence and defense posture beyond 2035, 2040?
Well, that's going to be a little bit complex as an answer, but I will answer. I think it starts with we have to remember the beauty of the NATO defense planning process as well. It's maybe a fiction, but it's a beautiful fiction. And the beauty of it is that it really does socialize allies into thinking in parallel terms, or at least raising the awareness of security agendas and security information intelligence pictures that are predominating in allied capitals. And the China annual reporting in NATO that began in 2019 is very important, because lots of Europeans do not still understand what is China and what is China up to, just like we have trouble understanding Russia. So that is the beautiful bit. Moving forward, then once you have awareness, what do you do? I think there are two answers to your question, Julian, and this takes us into a Hail Mary situation. But one is the technological base of Europe needs to improve, and its technological defense industrial base needs to improve. A lot of that is driven by the European Union, and it's a work in progress. We touched on it yesterday with Franco-German relations. And for it really to move forward, Europe needs to have an integrated capital market. Yeah. This is the Draghi report on why is there innovation in Europe, but it never leads to anything? And that's because there's a lack of capital, risk capital. So where is this supposed to come from? And I can tell you, it will come from the allies who are also very active in North Atlantic and in supporting Ukraine, and that is Northwest Europe. When they integrate their capital markets, you will begin to see an answer to your question. And then the other piece of the answer to your question is, they cannot copy the American way of war, because the US way of war is capital intensive, it's high tech, it's very platform driven. Europe needs to define it differently.
Yeah.
And once they have the capital markets and the awareness, the Europeans will have to think in parallel with all this, what is a European way of war? And once we're there, we're in a good place. But I think these are feasible processes, but we need a little bit of patience to move them along.
Thank you, Sten. I'm pleased to announce that the Alphen Group, which I have the honour to chair, is about to launch a very big project called the European Way of War.
Great.
And will address these questions that I think certainly will offer our policymakers solutions going forward. We've got about 17 minutes left. I want to start wrapping up. The question I want to give to all four of you is this. Okay, we're not in a terrible position, but we have to clearly do more. What is it that we collectively as allies and partners have to do to balance ends, ways and means so that we can credibly, in the minds of our adversaries, mount deterrence above all, that's the business we're really in, but in the worst case have to fight a war? And when I say our adversaries, obviously the Putin regime in Moscow, but whether we like it or not, China will be an increasing influence in our part of the world, and we need to recognize that. And therefore, what do we need to do to overcome what I would describe as denial in the minds of some of our policymakers about the changing scale, scope and nature of the threat that we'll face between now, 2040, and possibly beyond? I'll start with you, Sten, and go in reverse order. Sten, please.
Well, the condition of Europe is that governments are beleaguered in almost all countries. We experience the same degree of polarization in our political systems as the United States. We live it a little bit differently. But we shouldn't expect very strong leadership on this background. The governments are too fragile, too composed across the center. Sometimes we govern from the flanks, and that has its own vulnerabilities. Again, maybe patience. I will say one of the things we're obsessed about in Europe, partly because this is being the agenda being driven by the US and NATO, is about money and the defense burden shifting and the capabilities they can produce. We have a very limited, I think, strategic dialogue on who we are and who are our enemies. And I would maybe begin there, because all strategy begins with what do you want and who are you?
Yeah.
And we tend to immediately go to ways and means. What do we need to buy and how do we organize it? And then we start all over again next year. Maybe a small plea from this end of the panel, Julian, for a humanistic revival of European strategic thought. Who are we? And who is Russia and China? I think we're exceptionally weak on this. And one of the things I have decried for a long time now is that from 2014 to today, we haven't had a debate on who's Russia. Even though they've been behaving like a bully in a china shop, we're still not debating Russia because it's too difficult. And we can spend 5% on defense, but if we can't figure this out, it will not lead to strategy.
Yeah.
So at that end of the scale, I think we need to focus.
Thank you. Katarzyna, I've been doing this for far too many years, and I've suffered from what I would call the should syndrome. I've heard so many leaders in august groupings say Europeans should do this. Well, we're beyond that now. We have to must do things. So what in your mind is the must do that Europeans, particularly in the maritime domain and in the North Atlantic, given the evolving threat therein, what must we do?
I would agree with Admiral Belda, once again, that we must not be governed by fear, but also, but rather on a sober assessment of reality rather than wishful thinking. And I think that unless Russia unravels, we are going to expect sustained pressure, continued strategic signaling, probing our red lines, and testing of our cohesion. I think we already are at war. Russia has, the Kremlin has said that time and time again, we are already at war. We see that, it's already happening. And what we also must understand is that for the past 3 decades, that the approach to Russia, because we don't really have a strategy toward Russia, NATO doesn't have a strategy toward Russia, the approach to Russia has been based on conditions and assumptions that do not work anymore, including the fact that unilateral restraint has not worked. It invited aggression. A risk-averse approach has invited aggression. It hasn't worked. And reassurance has failed. A number of attempts over the past 3 decades, including in the nuclear policies. So the 3 no's from 1997, that there is no intention, no reason, no plan to expand, to change NATO's nuclear policy. It's still valid. Why? We should change, I think that. Yesterday, it was said we should not touch, basically, no reason to discuss a possible, for instance, the questions of expanding nuclear weapons to Northern Europe. And I think, why should we take this card off the table? It is also a negotiating card. So I think it's not about necessarily provoking Russia and escalating, but I think we need a much more self-reassured approach to Russia with much more resolve.
Thank you. Richard, ends, ways and means. What do you need?
Well, I don't think it's contentious to say that in the UK, ends, ways and means are not yet aligned, like much of Europe. I can't really speak for the nation, but what I can do is speak for the Royal Navy, or rather speak for what the First Sea Lord is seeking to do about that. He has developed very quickly a warfighting ready plan for 2029. And it's an arbitrary date. It's the end of his tenure. So he's going to do this for 4 years. So he's arbitrarily said, we need to be warfighting ready by 2029. And what he means, why that's important, that statement, is it's not the kind of jam tomorrow when we've got 13 new frigates and lots more F-35. It's effectively fighting pretty much with what we've got now, with whatever additive technologies that we can bring in at pace to give us greater mass and lethality. And so that's a really strong focus. But I think the success of the First Sea Lord at the moment is not just that he's doing that internally for the Navy and driving us all forward, but I think he's actually leading the debate across Whitehall, because there are no easy answers in the UK at the moment. And when our French colleague talked about money in France yesterday and the challenge of getting to a certain level of GDP, he could have almost been talking about London. Yeah. It's a very similar picture. So to give it, to answer your question more specifically, what do I need? More stocks, more lethality. For instance, our P8 is not yet lethal.
No.
And we're driving through that now. General Gwynne is leading the debate within our department and across Whitehall, arguably, and we'll get after it.
Thank you, sir. Oliver.
Well, I think even though NATO has been around for generations, we are not fully interoperable and we're not fully integrated amongst the nations. So I think one of the first things that we need to do is to use modern technology so that everybody basically information can flow seamlessly at the speed of light, real time, which is not truly the case as of now. And in 2026, if information cannot flow freely, you cannot fully capitalize on being more numerous and more capable than your potential enemies. So I think that's number one. Secondly, when it comes to the European technological and industrial base needs to be strengthened, and we need to make sure that armaments cooperation gets much stronger, because there's way too many factories in Europe producing different types of kit, whether it's ships or submarines. I think there's 20 plus different variants of frigates in Europe right now. Maybe just a couple would be enough. So I think that what Norway has done when it comes to submarines and frigate is good, but I don't see a lot of other nations doing the same. But if we don't go together amongst nations, we're not going to be able to benefit from economies of scale or synergies. And every nation is just going to be able to afford a limited number of military platforms. So that's the paradox of all these different sovereign nations, that as long as everybody wants to maximize their position, the collective position gets weaker. But I think that we are in a crisis right now, and the good old saying, never waste a good crisis, applies. The crisis is pushing for more cooperation, and we are seeing it across the board. So I'm positive, I'm quite confident that we will be able to get through this, but it's not a time to sit back and relax. We need to move at speed, and just like Richard said here, we need to be ready to fight, not only in 2029, but tonight or tomorrow if necessary, because it is our actual readiness that deters potential enemies, not what we're going to have 10, 15 years from now.
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you all. Let me wrap this up with a personal perspective. The North Atlantic, I began by explaining the sheer scale of the North Atlantic. And given that logistics and intelligence are in very many ways still the keys to the conduct of war, have been, always will be, the North Atlantic, probably more than any other theatre in which Europeans are engaged in existential warfare operations, is a testbed. Because of its scale, it's a testbed for multi-domain operations. Future war will see air, sea, land, cyber, space, information and knowledge as the 7 domains of warfare, not 5, 7 domains. Now, we need to fight smart. We need mass, certainly, but we need maneuver above all, particularly in the North Atlantic. But increasingly that mass will be driven by robotics. If you look at the development of the Chinese way of war, and I would suggest the American way of war, it is AI or AGI and robotics, which for democracies in particular will form the basis of future mass. Drones, unmanned systems, they are going to be a big factor, loyal wing types, as the jargon goes, in the North Atlantic. And future war is going to be absolutely brutal with platforms and systems. And we have to recognize that. We have to understand that our future war planning encompasses a whole range of platforms and systems beyond those planned manned systems that we currently have. What worries me about the European way of war right now, and about the British, French way of war in particular, is the danger of lowering the threshold of nuclear risk. We have relatively small, fragile conventional forces that don't have stocks, that lack logistics, the very things that can sustain a longer war, which is the very thing that the Russians and the Chinese are preparing for. If those forces, Norwegian forces, British forces, are forced to engage with a few or no American forces in a high-end warfight in the North Atlantic and elsewhere, we might find ourselves very early in the position of being forced to use the only weapon left to us, a strategic nuclear deterrent, because there is nothing else. There is nothing in between a broken conventional force and a high-end strategic nuclear force. I would strongly advise, in the North Atlantic, our countries in particular, it's not only about cooperation in operational advantage in the North Atlantic. It's about an entirely new concept of escalation in the North Atlantic. Escalation that starts with securing our home base, a much greater civil-military approach to resilience, a much stronger and coordinated defense technological and industrial base, much more aggressive offensive cyber operations, an understanding about offense and defense in space to ensure that we have the intelligence overview. I would strongly advise that we move beyond Five Eyes and take the risk necessary to share vital intel with those key partners that exist within Five Eyes itself. There'll be some leakage, but we've got to share a common operational picture of a big space to best use the capabilities and capacities to fight in that environment. And it is about how to fight a war in the North Atlantic that we should be preparing for. We must look at the worst case and plan and deliver accordingly, because that is the choice our adversaries are imposing upon us. If we can do that in the next defence planning cycle, through the alliance, which is what it's for, then I believe we can mount credible deterrence in the darkest moment when China has decided that it's time to dominate the Pacific through military means and imposes upon the Americans a simultaneous multi-theater crisis which stretches the Americans worldwide. Look at how they intend to fight and respond accordingly, and they will not fight. If we refuse to look at how they want to fight and allow them to impose the nature of war upon us, then we will lose. But that is the business we are in. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a real honour to chair this fantastic panel. I hope we've addressed some of the issues. Thank you very much. Thank you all. My final remark is that we now have a coffee break for 20 minutes until 11:50. Thank you all. Oliver.